On April 2, the world watched as 7 men blasted off from the Russian cosmodrome in a converted rocket booster. They were an unlikely crew. There was no national space agency or military backing their mission. These men had paid for their flight with their own money, making them the first space tourists. By the time they returned to Earth 4 days later, they had flown into orbit 3 times, experienced weightlessness, and even conducted some experiments in space. Their flight marked a new era in space exploration, one in which ordinary people could experience the wonders of space for themselves. But these space pioneers weren't just rich adventurers. They were also part of a carefully orchestrated publicity stunt by a little-known Russian company called Space Adventures. Space Adventures had been founded in 1998 with the goal of opening space travel to the public. The company's founder, a former Soviet military officer named Sergei Krylov, had a unique idea. He believed that the best way to make space travel more accessible was to find a loophole in the law. At the time, the only way for an average person to go to space was to become an astronaut. But becoming an astronaut was incredibly difficult. It required years of training and the ability to pass a rigorous physical examination, not to mention that most space programs were run by national governments or military organizations, which meant that only certain people could even apply. But there was one country where anyone could go to space if they had the money: Russia. In the early 1990s, Russia had inherited a fleet of aging spacecraft from the Soviet Union. But with the end of the Cold War, there was no longer a need for all of these vehicles. So Russia began to sell them to private companies like Space Adventures. With their new fleet of spacecraft, Space Adventures began to recruit customers. They reached out to wealthy individuals around the world and invited them to become space tourists. The price tag was steep, but for many of these men, it was a dream come true. In 1999, Space Adventures organized the first tourist flight to the International Space Station. The flight was a success, and it proved that there was a market for this new type of space travel. With the publicity from the first flight, Space Adventures was able to attract even more customers for their next flight. They recruited a colorful cast of characters for their second tourist flight. There was Dennis Tito, a 60-year-old American who became the first space tourist ever. There was Taco Doi, a Japanese journalist and TV personality. There was Leopold de Haas, a Dutch-Canadian businessman. And there was Ronan Parasart, a French-speaking Swiss. These 4 men were joined by 3 Russian cosmonauts on April 2001. They boarded a modified Soyuz rocket at the Bichenia Cosmodrome and blasted off into space. The launch was a spectacular sight to behold, and it was broadcast live on television around the world. As the rocket streaked through the sky, the space tourists inside experienced several minutes of weightlessness before the rocket engine cut off and the craft began to slow down. A few hours later, the tourists found themselves in orbit around the Earth. Their dreams had finally come true. From their vantage point in space, the tourists were able to see the Earth like they had never seen it before. They watched as clouds and continents flew by below them, and they took pictures of the amazing views. But the space tourists weren't just there for the sightseeing. They also had the opportunity to conduct experiments in space. Before the flight, each tourist had been given the opportunity to design their own experiment. And during the flight, they were able to carry out their experiments in zero gravity. For example, Denny Tito, the first space tourist ever, brought along a small hammer and nail. He wanted to see how long it would take for the nail to rust in space. Taco Do, the Japanese journalist, brought along a small plant to see how it would grow in zero gravity. When the space tourists returned to Earth 4 days later, they landed in Kazakhstan and were greeted by a large crowd of reporters and photographers. They had become celebrities, and they had proven that space travel didn't have to be restricted to astronauts or government officials. It was an exciting new frontier for ordinary people like you and me. As more and more people sign up for trips to space, who knows what amazing adventures await them? Maybe one day you'll be able to experience the wonder of space travel for yourself. Now check out Who Are the Richest People in the World? Or watch What is the Multi-Billion-Dollar Space Race Really About?